He had chewing at my ankles for miles, and people didn't usually open with theology when they planned on doing something ordinary like offering a ride. They asked if you were okay, if you had gas money, if you knew you shouldn't be walking alone after midnight with a storm shouldering the ridge like a bull about to break the fence. But he watched me with the steady patience of someone who had been waiting a very long time to speak aloud, a sentence he'd rehearsed through centuries, and the rain on the hood of his car hissed as if it were falling on something hotter than metal. I said yes because I wanted to believe I still did, because the alternative was admitting that the last hour in that motel room with the cheap lamp and the long, ugly goodbye had hollowed me out, and because his voice, low, precise, almost courtly, sounded like a hand extended to a drowning thing, and when he inclined his head, the overhead light found the sharp edges of his face, and the damp black hair combed back from a brow too pale for summer, and the old leather of the front seat creaked when I slid in, and the door closed with a finality that made the storm suddenly feel very far away. The car smelled faintly of cedar and something darker that reminded me, unfairly, of old cathedrals and winter cellars. And he didn't turn the radio on or ask for my name or offer his, just guided the machine back onto the slick asphalt with the sort of instead like the only speed the country could bear, a hush of tires through standing water, a silver thread drawn through a torn seam. I told myself to notice the details you're supposed to notice in a stranger's car. The scuffed glove box, the broken vent, the cracked map folded like a white tongue on the dash. But my eyes kept returning to his hands on the wheel, long and unringed, elegant in a way that suggested not softness, but discipline. And when lightning walked across the sky like bones under skin, I caught his profile in the ghost glass of the windshield and saw that he did not blink. The cross at my throat, the little silver thing my mother pressed into my palm when I left home the first time, warmed as if I'd taken it from a sunlit windowsill, and then cooled as if I'd dipped it in snow. And I told myself that was nerves. The muscle memory of childhood superstition. But when his eyes slid to the charm, and then away again, almost respectfully, I had the unsettling sense that the night inside the car knew mine by name, and was being careful with it. The sign belief anyone could reach me, and that I had been brave an hour earlier, and immediately discovered that bravery is the moment after you leave, when you realize the leaving will not protect you from the damage you carry. And he listened, as if there were a ledger in his lap and he was balancing columns. The rain thickened until the road became a ribbon under a veil, and he eased off the gas with a tenderness that made my throat ache, and said, almost idly, that storms like this could unmake a person's luck, and I laughed because I didn't have any left, and he glanced over. Then, just once, and for a breath the color in his eyes shifted, not red, nothing so lurid, but the deep garnet of wine held to a candle, and I felt an intelligent animal inside me go still and lift its head, and then carefully lie down. We passed a convenience store with its windows bandaged in neon and a gas pump swaying on its hinge, and I asked him about the car, because it was easier than asking him about his eyes, and he told me its year as if he were giving me an old poem, and the name of the man who sold it to him, and the road where it first hurt the world with its speed. And for a moment I forgot I had ever known another life than this midnight ribbon. When we crossed the bridge into town, the moon dragged itself out from behind a torn piece of cloud and laid a cold braid across the river, and the street lamps bloomed with halos that reached farther than they had a right to, and my necklace warmed. Again, this time decisively, the way it had the day my mother died, and I curled my fingers around the charm without meaning to, and felt its edges bite as if it wanted me to be awake. He saw the gesture and his mouth, beautiful, severe, softened in a way I would have called pity if pity hadn't so often been a weapon in my world. And he said, finally, like someone asking the question they'd meant to ask in the first place, if I wanted to arrive, or if I wanted to pause somewhere quiet and catch my breath, and the strange mercy of being granted a second choice after using up the first undid me a little. So I told him about the old roadside chapel on the edge of town, the one with stone shoulders and a roof that shed the weather like a horse shakes off flies, the chapel where I went when I wanted to stand, in a place that had existed before my mistakes, and he nodded as if he could see it from here. When he cut the engine, the silence landed hard, making the storm's breath audible in the trees, and we sat for a time that might have been minutes or the whole long winter, and it occurred to me that I should be afraid, because this was a man I did not know, in a car that seemed to hum with ancient patience, in a town that had learned to tell the difference between a working night and a predatory one. And yet the fear that rose in me was not of him, but of myself, of the part that would, at the first crack in the world, throw up its hands and say, "Fine, take me. I'm tired of doing the work of surviving." And when I recognized that, understood it cleanly, I found I could put my hand on the door and say thank you. And he said, without ornament, "You're welcome," and I believed him. The chapel's heavy door opened as if it knew my touch, and inside the candles kept their tiny weather lit against the dark. The beeswax scent soft as bread, and the roof leaked in one stubborn seam where the last storm had pried a slate loose. And the drip from that seam found the baptismal font with clockwork patience, so that each drop made a small, holy sound, as if the building were breathing. He stood just beyond the threshold, as though some private etiquette forbade him to cross, uninvited, and the air around him felt cooler, as if the world were negotiating an armistice. And I said, "Come in, because I am my mother's daughter." And she taught me that hospitality is a sacrament whether you share bread or silence. He did, with a half-step that looked like gratitude and ache braided together. And when he passed under the arch, the candles leaned, very slightly, not blowing out, not flaring, just acknowledging, and my heart did the same, which would have embarrassed me if it hadn't felt like a truth bigger than embarrassment. He moved down the aisle with the measured grace of someone who has been watched all his life and learned to make even stillness a beautiful thing. And at the front pew, where the old varnish had been worn to satin by prayer, he stopped, and I saw then that his gloves were not affectation but armor, and I wanted to ask what they protected, his hands or the world, and I was about to apologize for the smallness of the place and the meanness of the hour, when thunder rolled its slow barrel over the hills and all the windows white-laced with rain, and he flinched, not outwardly, not in any way a person on a date or a bus might notice, but something in him tightened like wire, and the cross at my throat warmed to the edge of a sting, and I thought unhelpfully of old stories where kings walked in common clothes and the countryside learned their names by the way the air changed when they breathed. He sat, finally, and I sat too, and it struck me that we were staged like penitents, and he said, his voice gentle down to something like dusk, that some roads return you by force and others by mercy, and this one had done both for him. And I asked if he was from here, and he smiled in a way that suggested the ground had changed under his feet so many times that here was a relative concept, and he said no, not from here, but from a place that has grown good at hiding itself. And I said me too, and we almost laughed, and for the first time since I had slung my bag over my shoulder and walked out of a room where a man told me I was hard to love, I felt the fragile, almost superstitious belief that maybe I was not. The drip from the font kept time with the storm, and in a strange, almost theatrical pause, the leaking seam above us stitched shut, as if the slate had changed its mind, and without the rhythm of the water, the silence opened like a curtain, and I heard something I hadn't known I was listening for. A second heartbeat, a little out of step with my own, as if the chapel had adopted us and was trying to keep up. And when I turned toward him with a question I hadn't formed, lightning made a white glass of the window beside us, and in it I saw our reflections. Mine, tired and stubborn, and his, impossibly still. And there was no reflection of him at all. I did not scream, because I am my grandmother's granddaughter, and she taught me that terror is a kind of invitation. And I did not run, because I have spent too long running to know it never gets you to a better country. And I did not raise the cross and brandish it like a talisman, because it had been a gift, not a weapon. Instead, I opened my palm so the charm lay against my skin, bright as a coin found in a river, and I said, with a steadiness that surprised me, that the question about forgiveness was a strange way to begin, and he bowed his head, as if at last we had reached the place the road had been trying to deliver us to, and in the candlelight, I saw regret pass over his face, like a cloud shadow over water. He said he could take me home, that he would take me home, that no harm would come to me from him, that he had done harm once and was paid out in full and would spend whatever remained of his long currency, undoing debts he could not unspend. And the chapel seemed to nod, the beam settled, the old stone exhaled, and I said I believed him, which is not the same as saying I understood him, and that is when the wind shouldered the door, and a gust lifted the metal bowl of the font and the drip. Found my wrist, cold, sanctified, and the cross flared as if kissing a coal, and then cooled at once, and I knew in a way that does not arrive as a thought, but as a recognition from some ancient, cautious part of the body that I had just placed my fate on the fulcrum of a stranger's promise, and that the night at last had taken its hands off me. We drove again, the road slick as a tongue, and he kept to the right hand of the lane with a soldier's precision, and the town rose ahead with its empty storefronts, and the pharmacy that still left its sign on all night, because hope needs a lighthouse even at 3 a.m., and as he slowed in front of my grandmother's little house with its stoop like a broken tooth, a siren unspooled somewhere far off, thin as a string, and he said, almost to himself, that the world wasn't finished. Asking for blood, and I told him mine was not available, not tonight, and he smiled the smallest smile in the history of mercy, and said, "Good. Keep it. You will need it." And I put my hand on the door handle, and then, because I have a bad habit of turning back when I have vowed not to, I looked at him and asked his name, and he gave it in a careful tone, as if he were returning a blade to its sheath. And in the instant the syllables touched the air, the cross at my throat answered like a struck bell, a warm, bright ache, and the porch light, which had been dead for years, flickered on, and I thought, with a clarity as crisp and frightening as new snow, that the night had delivered me not simply to a house, but to a story already in motion, and that whatever walked beside my shadow from now on would not be only mine. The house received me like a held breath finally released, a hush of old wallpaper, and the kind of dust that glitters when headlights rake it, and I stood for a heartbeat in the doorway, listening for the familiar rattle of my grandmother's sleep and the refrigerator's contemplative hum and the river's slow voice beyond the thin glass, and when none of those sounds carried any threat, I went to set my bag on the chair that had been my mother's, and found my hands shaking because a person can't survive the storm and still tremble in the quiet afterward. I told myself to drink water, to plug in the phone, to ignore the porch light's impossible resurrection, and I was reaching for the kitchen switch when I felt the night fold itself against the window like a large animal deciding where to lie down, and before I could decide whether to turn, the world decided for me, because my grandmother's bedroom door eased open, and her small figure in its cotton nightgown drifted out with the caution of someone who has learned not to startle her bones, and she said my name in that wool-soft voice that always made me 8 years old again, and I made the mistake of answering loudly because emotion is clumsy, and she flinched and then smiled and told me she had known I was coming when the porch light surprised itself into working, and that would have been the end of it, a tender, ordinary reunion stitched to a hard day. If not for the way, from somewhere outside, the rain slowed as if to listen, and a car engine that had no business returning idled once and went still, and the small hairs along my arms turned toward the window as if it had begun to sing. I told my grandmother I'd be right back, that I had to check something on the porch, and she nodded, already turning toward the tea kettle because her answer to every threshold was hot water, and I stepped into the doorway and saw that the road, which had been a slick black ribbon an hour earlier, now looked like a piece of film held to the light, everything on it too crisp to be night, and the trees kept their leaves very still, the way schoolchildren do when a monarch passes, and the gleam of the car's chrome down at the curb was modest, as if it wanted to apologize for being noticed. He was leaning against the fender with the kind of studied casualness you use when you must stand near a door in order to leave quickly without letting anyone think that's why you chose the spot. And when I said his name, the careful syllables he had given me like a blade sheathed in velvet, he looked up with an expression that would have read as relief if it hadn't been so old, and then he did a small, impossible thing. He bowed slightly, not courtly enough to be theater, just enough to move the night around him, and asked, in a voice tuned lower than before, if I would forgive the return, because he had driven 2 turns past the bridge when he felt the wrong kind of attention tighten on the road behind him like a loop, and he had learned in the long arithmetic of his life not to pretend he was miscounting when the sum came up danger. I told him the only wrong attention here belonged to the catbird that nested in the gutter, and the neighbor who believed in binoculars more than God, and he smiled like someone who appreciates small blasphemies. But his gaze kept sliding to the lit window where my grandmother's shadow stitched itself to the curtains, and he asked, with that same careful courtesy that never quite concealed how fast his mind moved, who else was home? And when I said her name, as if saying it were a benediction, he repeated it in a whisper that made the porch boards cool under my bare feet. And for a long breath, we stood there in a hush that felt less like silence and more like the moment before a violinist draws the bow. It would have been easy to pretend we were 2 people deciding whether to say goodnight, but the night had a memory, and so did my cross, which lay against my skin as if listening through the wall. And when my grandmother began humming in the kitchen, not a hymn we knew from Sundays, but a minor key thing that had lived in our family longer than any of our furniture, a tune my mother had used when the power failed and the house needed a voice. His head snapped toward the sound with the absolute attention of a hawk hearing the exact rustle its hunger had been waiting for, and the gentleness that he wore like a suit loosened at the seams, and something underneath rose, not violent yet, but closer to it than to peace. He asked me where she learned that melody, and the crispness of his diction turned the question into an investigation, and I wanted to say from her mother, who learned it from her mother, who said it came over the ocean in someone's throat because poor people do not carry harpists, but I said I wasn't sure, which was the foolish truth, and he took a step onto the porch, and then another, and the shadows that had respected the threshold earlier came with him now, as if they'd been told to heel. And I realized he had not truly entered my house. When he walked me to the chapel, he had merely accompanied me to its edge, and this was entry in the old sense, the one with consequences. The kettle began to sing, my grandmother's hum braided with it, and the silver at my neck warmed to discomfort, and I put a hand up, as if I could dampen the heat by acknowledging it. And he watched that gesture, with the concentrated sorrow of someone finding a familiar scar on a stranger's body, and said quietly that the pendant I wore had been blown from the ash of a queen's reliquary glass, that some smith with clever hands had drawn it into light-caught metal for a parish fundraiser at Bois. 100 years ago, and that there were only 3 such pieces left in the world, and none of them should have found their way into an American kitchen. The laugh that rose in me died the second it reached my tongue, because all at once the attention he had spoken of arrived, not in the shape of men on the road or the bright cruelty of sirens, but in the pressure of air, the way a weather front leans on a town before it takes the roof. And he moved so quickly I did not see the decision between thought and act, only the blur of black and the cool of his hand at my wrist as he drew me back into the shadow of the doorway, the other hand lifting as if to pluck a thread from the dark, and finding instead the latch, which he turned with the softest click, and then we were inside, and the porch light went out on its own like an obedient animal told to play dead. My grandmother called my name with that "do you take honey in your tea" cadence, not alarmed yet, just mapping the house by sound the way old women do, and he asked me to listen, not to him, but to the space under the floor and above the ceiling where a house keeps its secrets, and there, very faint, like someone dragging a fingertip down the varnish of a coffin, came the scrape of something at the back door, followed by a breath that was not wind and the simple, horrifying courtesy of knuckles against wood. I don't know which of us moved first, only that we reached the kitchen at the same time, and he put himself between me and the door, with the ease of a man who has spent a century refining the art of interposing, and my grandmother looked up from the kettle with her eyebrows already knitting into the shape they take when salesmen arrive in the middle of supper, and she made to go to the door, but he said, without using the word, "Please," and somehow meaning it anyway, that she should not. And she, who has always thrown towels over smoke alarms and told policemen to take off their shoes, stopped because something in his voice put the house in church. A second set of knuckles knocked, and then a third, farther along the wall where there was no door at all, and my grandmother did a very brave thing, which was to keep arranging cups while her hands shook, and the little inner animal in me that had lain down in the car stood up and bristled and took a step toward the threat, because Raj can be a kind of courage when you have nothing left to spend, and he blocked me again, not roughly, just as a tide blocks a stone, and said that the men outside were not men any longer in any way that would matter to us, that they had smelled his passage and followed it like moths do a coat, and that they would be happy to reduce this house to a story told at a bar in a decade, and that the only way we did not become the story was if we left now. And he turned to gather my grandmother with his eyes because he did not trust his hands, and she, taking him in properly for the first time, set the kettle down on a trivet as if the tea could wait for the revolution, and said she would not be carried by any stranger, and I loved her so entirely in that moment I could have torn out my heart and traded it for a little more of her stubborn breath. The scraping along the back wall became the slow, unzipping sound of nails lifting from wood, and the window over the sink, the one that looked toward the willow and the river, frosted white from the edges inward, though the night was not cold enough for it, as if someone were breathing winter against the glass, and he flinched with his whole body like a horse smelling smoke, and said that the river would not help us, and the willow would not warn us, and the only ally in the room was time, which was stingy and almost spent. He reached for me, and I reached back, and the cross between us heated to a fever that did not burn him, only the air, and he reeled as if someone had struck his chest with a truth. And then he said something that sounded like a somehow closer to bone than to ear, and he swore softly, but not at her, at whatever century had failed to warn him that the melody had left the court and walked in kitchens. And he asked, more urgently now, where she learned it, and she said in the tone she used on telemarketers and angels, that her mother sang it, and her mother before her, and that the words were none of his business. And I put myself between them because power was gathering in the room like weather, and because the last hour had taught me that my job in the world was suddenly to prevent collisions between the past and the people I loved. The back door gave up its argument and arrived in the kitchen open without having traveled through the intervening motion, an absence of door rather than the presence of a doorway, and the smell that came with it was not rot or blood, but wet iron, and a shape crowded the threshold with too many joints for a man and a grin that looked learned rather than felt. And he put his body in front of ours with devastating efficiency and asked it in a language that had the texture of knives whether it had come to bargain or to be broken, and it laughed with its shoulders because it had seen kings try to save kitchens before, and kitchens are where kings forget how much there is to lose. I understood that the next thing to happen would define us because stories are greedy, and they take their shape from the first true decision. And when he reached back without looking and caught my wrist to move me behind him, I did the impolite thing and refused, planting my feet and saying, with a steadiness I owed to the women who taught me to bake bread during thunder, that we would go when my grandmother went, and not a tick sooner, and that if he wanted our trust, he had it already, but if he wanted our compliance, he would have to earn it with something other than fear. And he turned his head the smallest fraction and met my eyes, and I watched him choose, watched the part of him that was all fang, and night redistribute itself along the scaffolding of restraint, and he inclined his head as if I had made a point at a council table, and said very well, but when we move, you do not look back. And then he stepped forward into the attention of the thing that had come for him, and asked it, with the particular kind of arrogance that belongs only to the remorseful, whether it recalled his name, and when it did and flinched, I realized the truth like a nail through silk, that the man who had asked me in the midnight road if I believed in forgiveness was not asking for mine alone, that a kingdom I could not yet see was balanced on the warm silver at my throat, and that the night had not made a mistake when it returned him to my door. The misunderstanding that brought him into my kitchen had already become the accusation that would carry us out of it alive. The thing in the doorway came on like a question nobody wanted to answer, all articulated hunger and borrowed manners, its grin slashed too wide, as if someone inexperienced with faces had tried to stitch one together from scraps. And as it took one experimental step over the sill, the air in the kitchen tightened until the glass in the cupboards muttered in their brackets, and the old linoleum sighed like tired skin. And Lucian moved with that beautiful, precise economy that belongs to dancers, and assassins, and men who have practiced the art of not missing for centuries, placing himself between the creature and the two women, without fuss or flourish, and simply absorbing the attention of danger, as if he were born to drape himself in it, which I suppose he was. He spoke to it again in that blade-textured language that made the lights tremble in their sockets, and the creature answered by laughing through its damaged throat and unscrolling a pair of hands that weren't quite hands. Only ideas of hands, rough as ropes and shiny where the storm had polished them, and then it moved too fast for thought, and I saw my grandmother reach for the kettle as if boiling water had ever saved anyone from what waits between stories. And, waking, and I reached for her and Lucian, in the same breath, reached for me, and the cross at my throat flared once like a struck match, and then held steady, as if it had decided to be fire for the duration. And the thing hit him with the weight of a small falling house. The counter snapped where Lucian's back kissed it, but he did not go down. He caught the creature by what it had made of a wrist, and twisted with the calm of a man closing a stubborn jar, and something important in its arm remembered it had once belonged to a human and let go of the whole idea of strength, and the grin faltered around the edges. And then he spoke a single word in plain English, a word that had not been used for greeting in a very long time, the old name that peasants whispered when they traded safety for drought at a crossroads at midnight, and the creature flinched backward as if he had struck it with a lit brand, which is when I understood that kingship, even in exile, remains a kind of currency. And he paid, with it as if the purse had no bottom. It would have ended there if the thing had been alone. But the back hallway exhaled 3 more shapes, like coughs from a bad chimney, thin and jointed, and wearing the neighborhood the way children wear their parents' coats, sleeves dragging, and they slid along the wall toward us with hungry deference, glancing past Lucien as if he were a respectable obstacle, and pinning their wants on the small woman by the stove, whose hum had become a line of defense she didn't realize she was drawing. And when the closest of them set a careful foot over the threshold, as if respectful entry might earn it sweeter prey, the cross against my skin pulsed in rhythm with my pulse, a strange doubling that made my vision sharpen until the world looked hand-carved, and the melody in my grandmother's throat changed almost of its own accord, tipping into the minor turn she used to lay over my fever when I was 5 and delirious, and it went through the kitchen like a river finding a dry bed, and the shapes at the doctor paused with their heads cocked, listening the way wolves listen when they remember the first fire. Lucian used that heartbeat to move, not with flourish, but with that exactness that makes flourishes look vulgar, and he took the lead thing by the jaw and pushed its face gently into the wall as if guiding a drunk, and when it resisted, he let the old voice come up from wherever he kept it buried and told it to kneel, and it began to, not because it wanted to, but because obedience is a muscle memory in some creatures that hunger has not fully erased. And then the second shape saw me, really saw me, not as a woman, but as a sound-wearing skin, and it made a noise so soft that it would have been sorrow if the mouth that made it knew the word, and it reached with its terrible rope hands in a gesture that was almost beseeching, and my grandmother's hum faltered because grief is a kind of interference, and as soon as the melody stuttered, the creature surged, and the cross seared like a warning, and the only thing my body could think to do was sing. It wasn't singing in the sense of notes and breath, and a finish held a half-second too long to show off. It was the way you carry a tune that has carried you, the way you return a bread starter to the jar, the way the river returns to itself after flood. And when I found the first phrase, it felt like stepping into a set of footprints left for me. And the instant the melody left me, the air changed its mind about what it wanted to be, softening like a field of wheat under wind, and every wrong thing in the doorway went very still. Not banished, not burning, but compelled. And Lucian's head turned as if someone had called his true name from a balcony, and he saw me. Not the human impediment he had chosen to protect, because honor has its own rituals, but the precise key to the lock he had been rattling for a very long time. He told me later there was a reason the melody lived in our house, a reason the old women drifted it through the rooms when the lights failed and the babies burned with summer fever, a reason it made winter tolerable and funerals survivable, a reason it moved the dead kindly along. In that kitchen, he only said my name in a voice that contained both warning and reverence, and then he added the bare word, "Continue." And I did, because obedience to the right command is not weakness, it is grace. The shapes lowered their heads, as if rain had finally arrived after a decade without it, and they had to listen to understand it. And while they bent, he moved in the interstices of their attention like a surgeon, laying hands on joints and whispers on teeth, turning hunger sideways until it forgot the door and wanted the road instead. And one by one he placed them back beyond the threshold with a tenderness that would have broken me if I had not already been broken cleanly into singing. And when the last of them had been persuaded to forget itself, he closed the door and set his palm flat against the wood and said a simple sentence in that knife language that I understood without knowing any of the words, because love languages are always mutually intelligible, and the house shuttered its windows inside its walls and said, "Fine, I will be a fortress for one night more." The silence that followed was not empty. It was crowded with everything that had not happened, which is its own chorus, and I stopped singing like a cart rolls to its destination, not abruptly, not with ceremony, just arriving at the note that says, "Here," and only then realized my legs were trembling so hard I had set them to shaking the way a table is steadied with a folded matchbook, and my grandmother put a hand on my back, the way women do when they are checking to see if you are still inside. "Your own body." And I was, barely. And she said, almost conversationally, that perhaps the tea was strong enough now, and Lucien sat down without meaning to, as if the chair had arisen under him to make an argument about mortality, and he looked at us, the way a man looks at a painting he knows now he will spend the rest of his life studying. He told me I had done what he could not, that the song had bent not simply their hunger, but his, because when it poured through the room, it poured through him as well, turning the edge of the long blade he carried inside his ribs and asking it to be something other than a weapon for once. And he said the word queen, as if it were both noun and verb and apology. And I understood that he had heard this melody when the world was younger, and he was not yet tired of choosing wrong, and that he had not heard it properly anywhere since, and that something more than memory had recognized something more than blood in me. It would have been the right time for retreat, a neat extraction into the safer room with the narrow beds. But safety is a temporary country, and the borders change while you sleep. And the thing about moments when the world turns its face toward you is that if you look away, you might never see it again. So when he said that what came next would not be possible without my consent, that what he needed to do would not stick if I did not choose it fully awake, I made myself look at him and at my grandmother and at the door that remembered every knock it had ever heard, and at my own hands which were steadier now that they had been used. And I said, as steadily as my mother taught me to say grace before meals, "Tell me what you require, and I will tell you if it can be afforded." He told me there was a binding, not the cruel sort that takes and harms and calls it vow, but the old kind that houses use when a storm wants their roof, a way of allowing him to mark the house through me, so that his ward would recognize this threshold as his to guard, and that it would feel like a brand because it was one, and that once it was laid, the thing in me that sang would not be mine alone, and if I asked him to remove it later, he could not, because the world is stubborn about some promises, and while he spoke, the cross at my throat cooled, not to refusal but to consideration, and my grandmother, who had never in her life given an inch to any official who came smiling, said, "Do it," and then looked at me because love is a permission too. I nodded, not because I wanted to belong to anyone, not because the romance of old words had dazed me, but because I could see the alternative as clearly as I could see the kettle steaming its little ghosts into the light. And my nod broke something loose in him that looked so like relief that I felt its echo low in my own limbs. He stood, and his hands hesitated a fraction from my face, not out of squeamishness, but courtesy. And then he touched the space just below the silver, where the sternum keeps its small door, and the cold rushed through my chest like a river reversing its course. And beneath his fingers, the skin took the warmth and thought about it, and then accepted it, the way earth takes a seed. And for a moment, I felt that second. Heartbeat again, not the house's, not mine, but an old rhythm that had learned patience. And when he stepped back, the room seemed both larger and easier to breathe, as if a weight had not been lifted but correctly distributed. The mark did not show unless I tilted my wrist, so the lamplight struck me just so. And then, there, a thread of crimson like the most delicate vein glowed and went quiet again. And he nodded once as if to a craftsman and said it would hold through. Sunrise and fail only if I lost faith in myself, which is a poor joke to make to a woman whose problem has lately been faith. And my grandmother snorted, which was her way of accepting a miracle without being foolish about it. And then, because the kitchen had been holding its breath and wanted normalcy like a dog, wants the hand that pets it, she poured the tea and we drank it hot and sweet and without comment until the cups made their tiny empty clinks, and I found I could laugh at nothing, and he found that he could too, and for a series of minutes the world forgave us our noise. The storm had moved off, but the road kept its rain gloss, and in it the reflection of the porch carried 3 figures that would, in daylight, look like any trio of night-sore people. And I wondered how many other kitchens had seen him lay his hands on a wall and ask it to be brave. How many other women had stood between the living and the almost, singing a song their grandmothers swore would keep the dark polite. How many times he had turned a doorway into a border, and how few of those doors had chosen him back, because that was the secret the mark had told me in the instant it settled, that houses know who to belong to, and melodies know who to bloom in, and relics know the temperature of the right palm. And as the hour turned, we reached the point in any night where either we sleep or we decide to move the furniture of our lives. And I said, without drama, that I would go where he needed me to, because whatever needed doing would only be half done without me. And the word that passed through his mouth in response was not good or brave or wise. It was my name again, this time spoken as if he had discovered it, written inside one of those illuminated capital letters monks used to paint at the beginnings of holy books. Tiny, vines and beasts curling around the initial, a secret garden hidden in the shape of a self. He told me we would have to leave before dawn, because the things outside were not the worst of what had scented him in our town, and that if we stayed, we would simply teach the wrong eyes where to look tomorrow, and that the place he could keep us. Breathing long enough to decide the next right thing was Old Stone, up in the hills that remembered the touch of monks and storms, and was not offended by the presence of regret. And when he said monastery, my grandmother's mouth turned into that thin, line that means she has already packed sandwiches in her mind. And I realized then the first terrible, miraculous truth of the night's bargain, which is that I had not only bound myself to a wandering king with too much winter in his voice, I had bound my house and the woman who built my better bones, because none of us were separate anymore, and the melody had made its choice. The pendant weighed what it had always weighed, a little nothing on a chain, and yet it sat heavy now with the knowledge that the reliquary glass that birthed it had once held the baked ash of a woman loved beyond the capacity of a palace to understand, and that the shiver that went through me when it met my skin in the chapel had not been accident. Lucian saw me trace a fingertip along its edge, and he said, apologetic as a man confessing that he has been clumsy with an heirloom, that the queen whose heart that glass kept had given the melody to her people once, and been forced by politics to take it back, and that this, more than any famine or war, had raised his country's spirit, because the wrong kind of purity is simply fear, with a sparkle on it, and the moment he said it the house seemed to nod in agreement, a modest settling of joists, and I thought, not for the last time, that I had misjudged the scale of the story I'd stepped into. We gathered quickly, because speed is a kind of virtue when you are running before dawn, and he insisted on carrying nothing but the weight that had already made a permanent home across his shoulders, and I insisted on the opposite, which was the bag, with the photographs and my grandmother's pill case and the old tin of buttons my mother had loved, because a woman carrying her past is weapon and lifeline both. And when we stepped onto the porch, the air had that washed clean ache storm's leave. And in it was the particular echo of roads being watched, and he paused at the threshold the way a man does when he tries to memorize the smell of safety. And then the mark shifted under my skin like a cat resettling in sleep, and I heard, not with my ears, with that little second sense the song had woken, the house whisper, I will remember you. And so we went into the thin blue before sunrise, with the world not yet certain what we had chosen, and the car's engine turned over without complaint, like a good soldier in the rain. And when I slid into the seat, the upholstery sighed, as if grateful to hold the body it had decided was lucky, and he drove with the care of a man who knows that you only get so many clean exits. And behind us, the town folded its darkness away and laid out its ordinary morning, unaware that in one kitchen 3 cups had cooled beside a door that would not open to just anyone again. The road to the monastery wound upward like a slow question that did not expect an answer, the kind that exists only to see who dares to finish it. And the car's old engine labored in a rhythm that was almost comforting after so much wet terror, a mechanical heartbeat to measure what hours remained before dawn. And every turn opened a view of mist-cloaked hills that looked less like geography than the interior of a thought someone had tried and failed to forget. My grandmother slept in the back seat, her chin against her scarf, her small breath keeping time with the windshield wipers. And Lucien drove as if the curve of the mountain were a memory he didn't trust, but couldn't help recalling, his eyes fixed ahead and his hands steady on the wheel, the knuckles pale where the effort of restraint gathered. I watched him through the reflection of the glass because looking at him directly felt like breaking some covenant, and the night gathered around us with a patience that suggested it had been waiting for centuries to see if he would finally come. Home, and the pendant at my throat warmed, not with fear this time, but with recognition. The first pale cut of morning began to loosen the dark, but the monastery above us still clung to shadow. It rose from the rock like something grown rather than built, a mixture of faith and architecture older than either of us, its bell tower, pointing one defiant finger toward the sky as if daring God to remember it. Lucian slowed the car near the outer wall, where vines had made poetry of stone, and the gates, massive, iron-veined, wearing the rust of several forgotten kingdoms, stood ajar, not inviting, but resigned. And when we rolled through, the sound of tires over gravel was too loud, like blasphemy in a chapel. He parked beneath a cypress that had seen more confessions than any priest, and for a long moment neither of us moved, as if the car itself had declared a truce between flight and arrival. Then he said, almost to himself, that the stones would know his voice, and stepped out, and the cold air embraced him with the intimacy of an old enemy. I helped my grandmother out, and her eyes widened at the sight of the place, though she said nothing. She had been raised among ruins that promised salvation and delivered mostly drafts, and she knew better than to compliment stone for standing. Still, inside the gate, the courtyard opened like a wound, half-collapsed cloisters framing a garden that had gone feral, the herbs long since intermarried with weeds, and in the center, a dry fountain, its basin filled with fallen leaves and old rain, where a single raven picked through what remained of an offering no one remembered leaving. Lucian crossed to the fountain and laid his gloved hand on its rim, and for the first time since the kitchen, I saw his shoulders unmake their careful geometry. He bowed his head and murmured something too soft for language, and the wind answered, a sigh pulled from the narrow mouth of the bell tower. When he looked up, his face had changed, not younger, not older, just more unfinished. And he said the monks who built this place had served the old night courts before they served the church. That sanctity was always a matter of repurposed fear. And that this was the only sanctuary left that owed him nothing, and yet might tolerate his presence for a while. My grandmother crossed herself reflexively, half apology, half insurance, and said the building smelled like stories. And he smiled faintly, the kind of smile that understands endurance as the only real virtue. We found what shelter remained in a side hall whose roof was mostly intact, a chamber once used for copying manuscripts. The walls bore faint frescoes of angels, who seemed embarrassed by their own wings, and the floor was a patchwork of flagstones, smoothed by knees and centuries. Lucian lit a single candle from a tinderbox he carried, though dawn had begun to silver the cracks in the mortar, and its small flame stretched eagerly toward him as if it knew the source of its appetite. He told me to rest, that the mark he had laid on me would hold until sunset, that the road would hide itself from pursuit once the sun was high. I wanted to believe him, but his voice carried the weariness of someone who had made promises to the world before and seen how poorly the world keeps its side of bargains. My grandmother, undaunted, arranged her coat as a pillow and closed her eyes, murmuring that if anyone came, she would pretend to be dead, because it usually discouraged conversation. And then she slept. Lucian stood by the narrow window, looking at the morning as though it were an experiment in forgiveness, and I joined him, feeling the cool seep of stone through my boots, and for a long time neither of us spoke. When he did, it was with that careful gentleness that precedes confessions too large for comfort. He said there were rules the night courts had written long before men learned to measure time in years, that power was not meant to survive remorse, that kings who felt too much for the mortals they governed lost the right to feed from them, and that, when he chose to spare a village during the famine of Black Frost, when he opened the grain stores and forbade the harvest of the living, the other rulers called it mercy and meant it as an accusation. His queen, her name spoken so softly the candle seemed to lean toward him, had believed compassion could civilize eternity, that immortality could be made kind, and together they had tried to weave a peace between blood and breath. But peace is slow, and hunger is immediate, and the night courts tore themselves apart rather than learn patience. He had killed her, he said, not out of hatred, but to save her from the spectacle of their failure. And the act had undone the world he ruled, turned its rivers to ash and its suns to carrion, and the punishment laid upon him had been neither death nor sleep but endless wandering among those whose lives end too soon. He told it all with the steadiness of someone reciting scripture, but the light that broke across his face through the cracked window had the cruel precision of truth, and I could not look away. When he finished, he said the melody I had sung was hers, that she had taught it to her people, so they would remember mercy even when night pressed its teeth to their doors, and that hearing it again in my voice had nearly undone the last discipline he possessed. I asked if he believed I was her, reborn or returned, and he shook his head, saying that reincarnation was a kindness the world rarely offered, that I was not her, but perhaps what remained of her promise, the echo the universe leaves when it cannot stand its own silence. Outside, the sun had found the courage to show itself, brushing the courtyard with a light so thin it seemed painted on, and for the first time since the night began, I felt something like stillness. The air smelled of damp stone and old lavender, and the ravens had gone, leaving the garden strangely watchful. My grandmother woke, muttered that even heaven must have drafts, and demanded breakfast. Lucian produced bread and dried fruit from some secret pocket, an offering both humble and absurd, and we ate in silence, the three of us bound together by exhaustion and something larger we did not yet name. For a brief hour it seemed possible that we had outrun whatever hunted us, that the mountain itself would keep our secret. But serenity is only ever the prelude to intrusion. The first sign was the bell, a cracked relic that should have been mute, tolling once, hollow and off-key from the tower. Lucian froze mid-breath, eyes flicking to the archway, and the candle's flame guttered sideways, as though the room had exhaled in fear. He whispered that the court had found him, not in flesh but in attention, that when a creature like him is noticed by his own kind, the notice is a summons, and that even sanctuaries have clauses. The monastery had survived centuries by negotiating its neutrality, but a neutral place cannot hide a guilty king forever. He moved to the fountain again, pressing his palm to the rim, and a faint red shimmer pulsed outward, tracing the old sigils carved beneath the moss, wards against both holiness and hunger, and they flickered like exhausted guardians trying to remember their oaths. My grandmother, unbowed, said she'd known from the start that no good ever came from men who used poetry to explain their mistakes, and that if his people wanted him back, they could damn well take it up with her first. He smiled without mirth and told her that if they came, they would bring enough night to swallow her defiance whole. As he spoke, the air thickened, not with wind, but with proximity. The light in the window turned the color of old wine, and the sound of distant wings gathered above the courtyard. Lucian said they would not attack by daylight, but would wait until dusk, when the boundary between forgiveness and punishment thinned. Until then, we were safe enough to choose how to die or how to survive. He looked at me, and the question behind his eyes was the same one he had asked on the road. Did I still believe in forgiveness? I wanted to tell him yes. That belief was a stubborn habit I had inherited, along with my mother's eyes. But all I could manage was to ask what forgiveness could possibly mean to someone who had lived long enough to invent the sins it tried to pardon. He said it meant remembering that even monsters are temporary, that the only eternal thing in the universe is the wish to begin again, and that perhaps the reason he had found me was not to seek absolution, but to learn how to ask for it properly. The sun crept higher, indifferent, and somewhere below the mountain, the first trucks of the waking world began to grind along the highway, their noise a reminder that humanity kept its own rhythms, regardless of the old wars being replayed in its shadows. Lucian closed the gate behind us and said the monastery would sleep again soon, that he could strengthen its wards only once more before it remembered who built it, and that before that, forgetting took us with it, we had to decide: flee into another hiding place, or stand here and make the world admit us. I looked at my grandmother, who had once kept a household running on less than the promise of daylight, and she said she was too old to start running uphill, but not too old to stand. And Lucian nodded, as though the old laws had been amended in that instant to include her. He drew a circle in the dust with one finger and murmured words that made the stones twitch in their beds. And when he finished, a faint glow spread through the cracks of the floor, the color of honey turned by memory into amber. That was the moment when peace, fragile and flawed, chose to stand beside us. The moment when the world stopped feeling like something happening to me and began to feel like something waiting for my answer. I realized then that whatever this man had been, a king, a murderer, a pilgrim of guilt, he was also a mirror held to my own fear, and that our survival depended not on the strength of his curse, but on the courage of my compassion. Outside, the bell tolled again, once more, a warning and a benediction, and the shadow it cast across the courtyard looked almost like the outline of wings folded for flight. Evening drew itself thin as silk over the stone, and for a while the monastery pretended it could pass as anything but a place where endings were stored. The pale light lay across the cloister like linen over a body, and the cypress kept its counsel, and because the clockwork of fear requires tasks to wind it, my grandmother insisted we boil water on a camping stove that had not seen a mountain since my mother was young, and we watched the blue flame shiver in the draught, and Lucian stood in the door of the scriptorium like a boundary somebody had decided to make man-shaped, and told us, with that careful courtesy he wore even when the world should have excused him from manners, that night would come soft at first, and then all at once, and that what hunted him would arrive with the patience of debt collectors and the speed of wolves hearing the hinge of a pen. He did not frighten me by saying it. The fright was already settled like fine dust in the folds of my coat, and what his voice did was arrange the particles into a map, and I found that a map is a mercy even when it only points to the border of a storm. We ate bread because there was nothing else to do with our mouths, and I tried to memorize the look of the courtyard with color still in it, the herbs gone wild, and the fountain dry as a prayer left too long on the tongue. And the raven returned and hopped twice along the rim, and then stared without blinking at the bell tower as if waiting for a cue. And in that dumb pantomime, there was something like omen, and I did not mind it, because omens are a kind of company that do not ask for tea. The first courier arrived in a form I would once have called natural, and now understood as policy. A black-feathered thing with a signet ring clutched in its beak, descended from the tower and dropped the circle of metal at Lucien's feet, as though it had refused to carry it any farther for fear of stain, and when he bent to lift it, the candlelight bent with him and touched the crest, and the crest made the light into wine, and my grandmother clucked, because she knows jewelry when it lies to her. He said, not quite to us, not quite to himself, that they had invoked the right of recall, an old law that bound the king to heed the court even in exile, that the ring bore the seal required to speak to the wards that lived in stones older than a prayer, and that the only way to refuse the summons would be to pretend he had never been king at all. And while he spoke, the scarlet thread under my skin stirred as if turning over in sleep, and I knew, by the way the room listened, that the place understood the ring, and did not like it, but remembered its obligation. We could have thrown the metal into the basin of the fountain and let it sit there like a sullen coin in a dry well. We could have cracked it with a rock or buried it in the herb bed with the forgotten time. But the law tied to it did not live in the object, but in every stone joint that wanted to believe its agreements still meant something, and I saw in Lucian's face the exact second when he recognized that the sanctuary would keep its word, even if he did not, and that tonight the price of hiding would be paid by the building that had offered us a bed. He set the ring on the ledge as gently as one sets a sleeping child, and said that dusk would bring envoys first, and blades later, that their patience would be as rehearsed as their cruelty, and that the part of himself that had learned to reconcile. Those two things was the part he meant to starve to death before morning. We prepared without drama because drama wastes breath. My grandmother lined up the pills in their little compartments, as if the apocalypse might let her keep to the schedule. I wrapped the strap of my bag around my chest because a woman who loses her hands should at least keep her memories. And Lucian walked the perimeter of the scriptorium touching stone, not as a conqueror, but as a man who thanks furniture after the guests have left. And when he came to the door, he hesitated, and I knew without, asking that his rules forbade what he wanted, which was to lock us in, to make the choice for our safety with the same arrogance that destroys all the gentler kingdoms. And instead he turned and said something like a vow in that knife language, only softer, thinner with wear, and the air shifted, and though no lock slid into place, the threshold acquired the feeling of a held breath, and we looked at each other like three people rehearsing a goodbye without admitting it. Twilight spilled itself through the arches, and the first envoy entered as a voice, a woman's, framed in the formalities of the courts that have forgotten why they keep them. She called Lucian by his throne name, the name with too many syllables for human throats, and she asked permission to approach because etiquette is the rope you tie around a scene when you don't want the blood to splash the art. He stepped into the courtyard, and the bond under my sternum tugged with the reflex of a hound whose master has strayed past a hedge, and I followed to the edge because obedience has to be learned from both directions, and the woman revealed herself. By degrees, first the color of her voice, then the cut of her silhouette, then the eyes that held all the cleverness of an old city, and she bowed to the degree that counts as insult, and said that the court was prepared to treat with him if he would release his mistake, by which she meant me, and that in exchange they would end the petition filed by the rebel households to have him declared unkinged, which would have saved no lives, but would have made the minutes of the meeting read more pleasantly. He laughed once without humor, and told her that mistake was a word used by people who want to pay with paint instead of wood. And while they bartered metaphors, I watched the wall above the gate take on the faint shimmer of a sigil waking. Old lines, rekindling like veins, and understood that the ring had already begun its work. The wards consulted their contract, and the monastery, loyal to its own survival, started to open a little to the hand. It recognized as lawful even if the man who once wore it refused the law. The moment of betrayal did not arrive with a trumpet. It came with the ordinary sound of sandals on stone, the small, practical shuffle of a man carrying hot water, an old monk in a habit patched with care as if poverty were his job and not his. Condition, and my grandmother turned to smile because attention to kettles is her favorite kind of holiness, and the smile died before it finished being born, because she caught the way the steam from the bowl in his hands rose strangely, not as mist, but as shapes that tried to remember being letters, and she said the word no with the force of a prayer trying to rewind time. But the old monk had reached the arch and was already lifting the bowl, and the steam unscrolled and touched the lintel and left there, briefly, the outline of the court seal, and the monastery sighed like a tired clerk stamping an unwelcome form, and undid its resistance with the weariness of a promise kept past wisdom. Lucian swore, not at the monk, who lifted his eyes and met his with a concern that did not know guilt, because obedience is a lens that narrows even as it clarifies, but at the apparatus of law that teaches stone to mistake the letter for the soul. And the envoy smiled with all her teeth and said sweetly that the sanctuary had recognized its master's mark, and that the path was open, and that anything that happened now would be a matter of internal governance, and thus no sin at all. They came without haste, because haste reveals fear, a file of figures in deep gray with their faces uncovered to prove they were not ashamed of the light, and their hands empty to prove they required none to do harm. In front, a man whose height made the cloister bow a little as he passed, and whose eyes were the cold blue of water 2 days after a drowning. And I knew without introduction that I had met the architect of the summons, and the plan, and the hunger, the one who would have called, himself a steward in gentler times, and now wore the work of a usurper as though it were a hair shirt that purifies by making you bleed, and in his mouth my name would have sounded like a diagnosis. He said Lucian, as if he were returning a library book he had kept too long and meant to pay the fine with grace. He called me the human, as if it were a description and not a category, and he nodded to my grandmother with the thin respect one shows to habit, not to person, and I searched his face for the concession to doubt that saves monsters from their own myths, and found only the satisfaction of a ledger that has balanced itself at last. He said the court would care for its errant king. The monastery had no right to conceal stolen property, and the smell that came with his words was the clean cold of an operating theater that has forgotten that successful surgery is not the same as life. If the scene had ended there, it would have been terrible but survivable, a page in an old book without illumination. But the world loves tableau, and so it arranged one at our expense. The raven lifted from the fountain and tore a black scribble through the air, and the bell tolled a third time, and from the tower a rope uncoiled by itself, like a snake mad to shed its skin, and the man in gray gestured with one lazy finger, and the rope became an iron thread, and the iron thread leapt for Lucien's wrists as quick as a rumor, and bound them, and the light around the knot took on the precise, disagreeable sheen of the ring on the ledge, as if objects were laughing among themselves at our naivete. He did not cry out because he has never been a man who gives his pain away, but I felt the bond flare against my chest, as if someone had struck a match inside my ribs and blown it out with malice. And I tried to step forward, and my grandmother sat, her hand like a nail in my sleeve, and said, "Not yet, not yet, not yet," because she has stood in kitchens while men with little badges tried to take what was hers, and learned the patience that embarrasses authority. The envoy spoke something pleasant, and the men in gray moved like a tide, and Lucian did not fight, because fighting the rope would have sharpened it, and he did not plead, because pleading is a currency he has refused to use for longer than our calendar can calculate, and the whole of him turned inward toward endurance, and I understood with the unpleasant clarity that arrives in hospitals that he had decided to let them take him, if by doing so he could keep us unbroken. And because I am a woman with a catastrophic allergy to being left behind, I stepped out of my grandmother's hand into the path between the tide and the man it meant to drown, and said the only thing I had that mattered, which was his name, not the one the court loved to polish, not the one the churches carved on their warnings, the syllables he had given me on a curb in the rain, and the sound of it unbalanced the room for a fractional moment. And in that sliver of time, I had choices, and I took the wrong one for my safety, and the right one for my heart, which was to make the pain choose me. It is strange how instinct knows the choreography of sacrifice, even when the mind has never rehearsed it. I went to the fountain. I broke the surface of the old rain with my palm. I slammed the pendant against the stone lip until the chain tore, and the reliquary glass cracked like ice in spring, and the cut along my hand opened like a red mouth. And when my blood touched the carved sigils that lie hidden beneath the moss, they woke as if grateful to be needed, and lifted an answering light. Not holy and not profane, something older than both that smelled like iron and peonies and old books. And the court's rope flinched, though iron does not flinch, and the envoy lost a syllable mid-prepared sentence because the air had changed spiritual. Addresses without asking. I do not remember deciding to sing. I only remember that my grandmother began humming the old melody in that low throat voice she saves for fevers and funerals, and it rose through me like water rises through a stalk, and the words that have never had, words unfurled and wrapped themselves around my breath, and the light from the broken pendant climbed my arm in a slow rope of silver and red, and settled along the little brand beneath my collarbone, and blossomed outward over my chest in a map of us, yet knew how to read, and the sigils in the floor answered with their own geometry, and for a moment the entire monastery wore a lattice of light. The old agreements written in a language of mercy no council meeting had been able to erase. The men in gray surged the way bureaucracies surge when a person introduces an unanticipated variable, and the first of them reached me with his hand out, as if to pinch a candle between finger and thumb, and his skin met the light and learned the first syllable of refusal, and he pulled back with a hiss that gave me the smallest mean pleasure, and I would have smiled if the pain had not begun its work. Pain, when it is aimed correctly, is a powerful architect. It builds the necessary room where resolve can stand upright, and I stood there in that new room while the broken glass stitched heat through my palm and the silver fire crawled across the front of me, and the melody bit down on the air. And I understood that the thing in me that could shelter a king wasn't love, not yet, because love needs time to grow its bones. It was the narrower and perhaps sturdier thing called mercy, and it does not require desire to keep its vow. I spoke then, not to the men, not to the envoy, not to the gray-eyed steward who watched with pleased contempt, but to the rope that held the wrists of the man who had asked me on a road if I believed forgiveness was real, and I told the rope it was, mistaken about jurisdiction, that this threshold belonged to the song, and the song belonged to the dead queen, and the dead queen had left her heart in a glass that a blacksmith made into a trinket, and a mother pressed to her daughter, and a stranger admired in a kitchen, and law, when properly reminded of its origin, can be shamed into better behavior. The rope loosened the smallest fraction, because humiliation is a solvent, and Lucian looked at me as if someone had opened a window in a sealed carriage and let winter whip the sweat from his face. The steward moved then, because the careful men always wait until the correct lever appears, and he raised his hand and made the smallest, dullest gesture, as ordinary as tapping ash from a cigarette, and 3 iron pins the thickness of knitting, needles lifted from the hem of his coat and crossed the air as if they had been told to behave, and before the light could remember the particular defense for that sort of argument, they slid into me, one low near the hip where a singer keeps breath, one higher along the ribs where a mother feels her child's first kick, one just beneath the clavicle where the mark had settled, and they did not make any noise, but my world did. A terrible, echoing bell inside my skull that called everything home at once, and all at once the light burst from me with the delayed fury of a dam allowed its flood, and struck the courtyard in a dome, an answering blossom that shoved the men in gray backward as if they had been sketched in charcoal, and the rain had come, and the envoy went to her knees with a laugh that sounded like despair, and the steward took a deliberate step back into the doorway where law likes to stand, and Lucian cried my name, and then could not speak because he had never spoken it, through blood. I do not want to make a performance out of falling, but fall I did, and the stone came up to meet me with the grim courtesy of a gurney, and the world shrank to the brilliant, indecent intimacy of shock, and somewhere in the near distance, men remembered being human long enough to fear what they had done, and then forgot again, and my grandmother's hands were everywhere, salt and heat, and the small, practical lies of comfort, and beyond her shoulder, the dome of light held like a lung filling, and emptying slowly, every exhale pushing our enemies farther from the threshold, every inhale letting them remember their numbers. And in the center of the courtyard, the man in irons stood without the use of his hands and tore at his bonds with the only tools he considered dishonorable to expose, which were his teeth and his grief. And when the rope gave, a strand at a time, he did not run for the men, he came for me. The dome did not know his name. It knew only the pain that had birthed it, and the boundary it had been asked to defend, and it threw him as it had thrown the others, not far, not hard enough to break, but with the terrible, mechanical impartiality of weather, and he hit the edge, and his body made a noise that made the ravens lift again, and the look on his face will be the last thing I see if the world ever denies me another dawn, because it was the expression of a man who has done every wrong. There is and is not allowed, for one more breath, to do the single right thing the universe has finally asked of him. He spoke then, not with his court voice or his battlefield voice, but with the small voice that is reserved for a child alone in a room you cannot reach. And he told me to stay, not the foolish command men give to women they mean to save, but the plea. You offer to someone who is building a bridge beneath your feet out of their own bones, and you don't know how to bear stepping on it. The steward, recognizing that the moment he needed had passed, and that what remained was management, signaled his men to withdraw to the gate, and said, a little too loudly, that the court had witnessed an assault on its officers, and would record the injury accordingly, that the king's capture was neither necessary nor desirable when he had already submitted to a higher punishment, and the envoy, recovering her poise with the speed of a woman who has practiced masking terror for sport, added that, as soon as the humans ceased to generate an unsanctioned ward, they would resume their business, and until then, they would wait in the threshold to avoid accusations of sacrilege. And the legal theater of their retreat was so exact it could only have been written in advance. They left a guard behind, a boy with a face still innocent of his own cruelty, and told him not to enter and not to look away, which is the recipe for madness. And then the gate gathered them into its throat, and the courtyard belonged again to us, and the dome and the cold work of deciding whether I would continue to own the next slow breath. It is embarrassing to write about the mechanics of pain as if they were poetry. But the body in extremity has its own lyric, and I would be dishonest if I pretended that the next span of time was anything but a series of negotiations between the part of me that wanted to finish and the part that had begun. One pin breathing heat along a nerve like a moth scorching its wings. One pin remembering a childhood fall against a table and remixing it with the iron's taste. One pin singing a thin la-la of the melody that now tried to keep me here. And while I bargained silently, my grandmother said all the words I could not. And Lucian knelt against the barrier, like a man kneels against a confessional screen, and told the air that if I stayed, he would empty the court of anything that had ever learned to be cruel, and if I left, he would finish the work and then walk into the morning with his hands open. And I could hear, beneath those vows, the naked hope of a child asking a door to open because he has finally found the courage to say sorry without arguing his case. And it steadied me more than the pressure of cloth against the wound, and I set my breath to his rhythm, and for a while we pretended the world would keep time with us. There is a thing that happens in old buildings where the stones, which have been dutifully cool for centuries, decide to lend you some of their memory, not in visions or voices, but in the simple temperature of endurance. And the floor did that for me, then offered me its long ache so that I might rest my smaller one inside it. And while I lay there and pretended to be as old as the monastery, my palm bled its quiet thread onto the sigil, and the light learned gentleness, it dimmed to a lambent skin that still refused the wrong, but no longer punished the good. And when Lucian pressed his hand to the barrier, the sting that had flung him softened to the heat of recognition, and the structure that had meant to keep everything out reinterpreted its assignment and kept only the harm at bay. He slipped through, the dome letting him the way a mother lets a son pass after he's learned which rooms require quiet. And he came to my side, and his hands did not shake because he had made them stop shaking. Long ago, and he asked me with his eyes for permission to do the one thing he had promised himself in 100 bad nights he would never do again. I am not foolish. I know what it means to let a hunger put its mouth where you live. But I am also not sentimental enough to pretend there is a clean choice in the world between purity and rescue. And so I nodded, and he bit his own wrist, because that was the only way he would take from anyone what he meant to give to me. And the blood that came was not a color I had a word for. It was the shade of those old stained glass windows when the storm is lit behind them, and the saints seem briefly to breathe, and he pressed it to my mouth, and I gagged once because the body is a creature with its own flags and passwords. And then the melody that had been waiting in me got over its formalities and opened the door, and the taste joined my body, and began to make the smallest repairs with the modesty of a man who pays debts quietly. And the pain did not cease, but it ceased being the only room in the house. And somewhere beyond the wall, the boy at the gate cried a little, because someone out there remembered being loved, and the memory leaked into him through the mortar. I slept then, not as a person sleeps when she is tired, but as a candle sleeps when someone cups it with both hands to keep it alive in a wind. And in that narrow and industrious dark, I had the sense of a figure crossing a high bridge very far above, ground carrying something wrapped in old cloth, and when I woke, the world had not ended, which in itself felt impolite after so much theater, and my grandmother was humming again and threatening the pins with the sterilized needle from her sewing kit. As if she could knit the damage closed, and Lucian was watching me with that expression I had seen first in the chapel and then in the car mirror, a look that mixed awe with terror, with relief, until the result was something that might be mistaken for love if one were lazy, and he did not kiss me because his rules are older than mine, and he would not squander what he had asked from the morning by paying it forward into a mouth that had almost not survived. But he said my name as if speaking it, made a light in his throat, and I took his hand, because touch is the grammar the wounded can still conjugate. Dusk finished, and night arrived with the authority of a signature, and the men at the gate altered their posture to the shape men make when they think their turn has finally come. And the envoy rolled her shoulders like a woman about to dance because some people cannot survive a world without choreography. And the steward examined the ring and considered the monastery with the professional attention of a landlord assessing damage after tenants have moved out. And inside the redrawn ward, the three of us drew breath together, and the mark under my skin settled like an animal circling twice before sleep. And the world understood, for just the barest sliver of an hour, that the attack had been repelled not by force, but by the refusal to exchange mercy for order, and it turned its face, the way a river does at a bend, and set us on a new course, toward the reckoning I had started to suspect was the real reason he had come to my curb in the rain, and asked me a question that had changed the direction of all our roads at once. Dawn never truly came. It only disguised itself as mercy. The sky above the mountains paled with the false calm of smoke after a fire, and the monastery, which had spent the night holding its breath, released a groan through its walls like a ship cracking its keel against ice. My grandmother was still awake, her face drawn into a map of exhaustion and stubborn faith, her fingers stained with the dark residue of healing herbs she'd used to bandage what she could not understand. Lucian had not moved from where he sat near me, back against the altar stone, the veins beneath his skin dimly lit, as though a storm were trapped in them. He was still, but not calm, the stillness of a predator holding itself away from its own nature. The mark between us pulsed faintly, tethering breath to breath, and every time it flickered I felt the ache beneath my ribs hum with the echo of his heartbeat. Proof that his life now moved in the rhythm of mine. It should have frightened me, that kind of bond. But it didn't. It felt like inevitability finally putting on a familiar face. Outside the gates, the enemy waited, but the night had taken something from them. I could feel it. Their presence pressed against the edges of the ward, but the sound was weaker, diffused, like a tide rolling back through broken reeds. They were afraid now, and fear makes soldiers human again. Yet fear also makes leaders reckless, and I knew, as Lucienne did, that their general, the blue-eyed steward who had twisted law into punishment, would not retreat until he could feed the dawn his victory. There are men who believe redemption can be stolen, and he was one of them. I wanted to ask Lucienne what the steward had been before corruption claimed him, but I already knew the answer. Every tyrant begins as someone who believes too much in order. Lucian rose finally, and the movement filled the chamber with quiet authority. He did not look at me at first. He looked toward the broken window, where the horizon bled pale gold through the mist. "They'll try once more," he said, not as a warning but as acknowledgement of the rules, and this time they'll bring daylight with them. His tone was calm, resigned, but his hands trembled slightly when he reached for the relics on the altar, the fragments of broken saints and copper discs etched with forgotten prayers. He placed one of them over the brand at my chest, and the contact seared like ice. "This is the seal," he whispered. "If I fall, it will break. When it breaks, you'll have to choose whether to call me back or let me go." "Then I won't let you fall," I said. But the words felt naive the moment they left me. He gave a faint smile that held too much history to be kind. "Even gods fall," he murmured. "Kings are only the rehearsal." He turned away before I could answer, drawing his coat over his shoulders like armor. The shadows seemed to recognize him again, not as prey, but as their old sovereign, and they gathered obediently at his feet. For a moment, the weight of his age filled the room, and the air grew dense with the unspent gravity of centuries. He had been hiding it until now, folding himself small enough to sit beside mortals. But in the face of his final reckoning, Lucian unfurled. The first strike came not with sound, but with light. A spear of morning sunlight broke across the courtyard and shattered against the ward, sending shards of brilliance through the stone corridors like knives made of hymns. The men outside had turned the sun into a weapon, mirrors raised on spears, blessed glass forged in the image of purity. It was beautiful and obscene. The air blistered. The scent of ozone and burning dust filled the sanctuary. My grandmother cursed quietly, something old and human, as she dragged what remained of the holy water across the doorway, muttering that the world never runs short of fools who think fire cleanses everything. Lucian stepped into the path of the light, and it struck him square in the chest, flaring against his coat. Smoke rose from his skin, but he didn't flinch. He lifted his hand, and the shadow around him coalesced, forming a barrier that met the assault with the softness of velvet and the density of a black hole. The mirrors outside cracked. The ward shook. Somewhere, a raven screamed, and its wings burst into flame midair before collapsing into ash. That was the signal. The gates gave way with a groan that was almost relief, and the soldiers poured through like water through a broken dam. They were not the graceful monsters of myth. They were tired men, animated by centuries of discipline, their armor dull with ritual, their eyes blind to the horror of obedience. Lucian met them not with rage, but with precision, moving as though he were carving a confession into the air. Every strike was deliberate, sorrowful, almost ceremonial. When he touched them, they disintegrated into dust, not destroyed, merely unmade, returned to the hunger that birthed them. The courtyard filled with a gray storm of what used to be hatred, but the steward remained beyond the threshold, watching with that cold curiosity of bureaucrats who treat tragedy as arithmetic. His hand rested on the hilt of his sword, a blade forged from the bones of the first vampire who had defied heaven. When he finally drew it, the air bent. It was not a weapon. It was a verdict. Lucien saw it and stopped. "That blade remembers me," he said softly, as though to himself. The steward smiled. "All blades remember you. You wrote The Art of Regret, my king." The word king rang with venom, a title stripped of reverence. Lucian answered with silence, the kind that kills without striking. He took one step forward, and the ground beneath him cracked in a circle of frost. The mark on my chest flared. The connection between us pulled taut, and for an instant I could feel the sheer weight of his despair. The centuries spent collecting guilt like relics nearly knocked me to my knees. The steward raised the sword, its edge a line of white fire, and the world slowed. Lucian could not dodge. The light held him as surely as chains. I moved without thought, my body remembering what sacrifice feels like. The song, the same melody that had saved us in the kitchen, rose unbidden from my throat, the sound catching in the high arches of the monastery until it became a choir of one. The blade hesitated midair. Even steel can doubt, if reminded that it was born of earth. But the steward pushed through its hesitation and swung, and the impact exploded with a sound like breaking glass. I didn't realize until afterward that I had stepped in front of Lucian, that the strike meant for his heart had found mine. There was no pain, only the sensation of being peeled open by light. The world went silent except for the beating of two hearts, his and mine, colliding in the same cage. I saw the look on his face, that raw, ancient grief uncoiling from the center of him, and I knew he had seen this once before. The mark between us ruptured. The seal shattered. The divine spark that had hidden in the bloodline of my family for generations woke all at once, furious and blinding. The light that erupted from me tore through the courtyard, scattering the soldiers like leaves in a storm, and when it reached the steward, it burned away the illusion of his humanity. What stood there was not a man, but a structure of bones and hate, the last architecture of tyranny, screaming as it remembered it had once been alive. Lucian caught me before I fell completely, cradling me as if my body were something that could still be held together by hands. The blood on my chest was already cooling, but where it touched him, it ignited, painting his skin in threads of gold. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice breaking between fury and awe. "You gave me back what I tried to bury." I tried to answer, but my mouth could only shape the word, home. He pressed his forehead to mine, and the mark that had burned between us reignited, not as curse, but as bridge. The blood from my wound flowed into him, and his into me, until there was no telling where one began. Around us the light condensed, gathering not as destruction, but as form. It filled the broken glass of the chapel windows, painting new saints in colors unseen since the world was young. The steward's scream faded into a wind that smelled of iron and myrrh. When the light receded, nothing of him remained but the sword, lying dull in the dust. Lucien lifted it and looked at its edge, now harmless. "Every empire ends," he whispered, "but not every end deserves mourning." His eyes, once crimson, now burned gold, reflecting the dawn that had finally found courage to cross the mountains. My grandmother stood by the altar, weeping silently, not for me, not even for him, but for the sheer enormity of what forgiveness costs. Lucian carried me to the fountain, where the water had begun to flow again for the first time in centuries, clear as glass. He washed the blood from my chest with trembling hands, murmuring words I could not understand, words that made the water glow faintly, as if remembering its origin. "You'll live," he said, but it sounded like a prayer rather than a promise. "The song isn't finished. It never was." His hands shook as he brushed the hair from my face, and for the first time I saw him cry. The tears were not blood. They were clear, human, fragile. I touched his cheek with what strength remained. "Then finish it," I whispered. "Sing it to them, to all of them." He nodded, and his mouth found mine. Not hunger, not salvation, but something quieter, a benediction between equals. When he drew back, I saw the light behind his eyes swell until it filled the world. He stood, turned to the ruins of the courtyard, and raised his arms. The last of the shadow obeyed, wrapping him like a mantle. The sunrise poured through it, turning darkness into molten gold. He sang, not words, but the sound of release, and the melody reached beyond the monastery, carrying through the valleys, down the river, into every forgotten corner where fear still held dominion. The mountains answered with thunder. The air itself knelt. The dead wind of centuries changed direction, and for a moment, even the sun hesitated, uncertain whether it was witnessing redemption or the birth of something entirely new. When it ended, he was gone. The light faded to morning. The fountain's water stilled. Only the sword remained, planted upright in the courtyard like a gravestone or a promise. My grandmother helped me stand, her hand steady despite the shaking world. The mark on my chest glowed faintly, no longer red but white, like breath on winter glass. Somewhere deep inside it, I could still feel him. Not a presence, but a rhythm, steady and patient. Waiting. The monastery had stopped groaning. It exhaled instead, the sigh of a place finally freed from history. We stepped into the new light, and for the first time in my life, the world did not seem divided between human and immortal, sinner and saint. It was simply a wake. Behind us, the fountain overflowed, its water running down the steps in rivulets of silver, carrying with it the ashes of everything that had tried to separate us. The wind shifted, carrying the faintest echo of a voice, Lucian's voice, singing the last verse of the song I had begun. It wasn't a lament anymore. It was a beginning. The world after the storm was so quiet. It felt newly made, as if someone had wrung it clean of noise and left it to dry in the sun. The monastery no longer looked like a ruin. It looked like the idea of a place that had survived itself. The air was washed of the metallic scent of fear, replaced by something soft and uncertain, like bread beginning to rise. The sky above the mountains had abandoned its bruise and turned the color of diluted honey, and the bell that had tolled for centuries in grief now hung motionless, a mouth finally satisfied with silence. My grandmother sat near the fountain where the water still glowed faintly from the morning's miracle, her hands folded around the handle of her teacup, as though she had always known the world would demand ceremony after salvation. I moved carefully, as one does in the first hour after an illness breaks. Every breath a small rehearsal for being alive again. Every heartbeat a negotiation between what I had been and what I had become. The wound on my chest had closed into a pale scar shaped like a crescent moon, the mark's light subdued to a pulse I could feel only when I was very still. The sword Lucian had left stood in the courtyard, its blade half buried in stone, and the sunlight kept finding it, as if unwilling to believe that anything once born of darkness could hold that much brightness without shattering. The monks who returned later that day came walking from the valley in 2s and 3s, uncertain whether the road still led to the same place, their robes smelling of earth and rain, their faces creased not with fear, but reverence. They found us sitting on the steps as though we were the keepers of their long sleep, and when they saw the courtyard transformed, the weeds turned to silver grass, the old fountain singing, they bowed not to me, but to the air itself, sensing that whatever had happened here had not finished happening. I told them nothing they could write down. Miracles belong to rumor. The truth breaks too easily in hands that try to catalog it. My grandmother, more practical, told them to fetch bread and wine and make themselves useful, and soon the ancient place smelled of yeast and rosemary and a little smoke, as if the world had decided to make peace in the language of kitchens. They asked who the man had been, and I said only that he was gone, which was true, though the air around us still remembered his voice. They asked if he would return, and I answered that kings who have laid down their crowns rarely walk back through the same door, but sometimes they send the wind in their stead. As the days unwound into weeks, the monastery became something other than sanctuary or tomb. People from the villages began to climb the hill again, drawn by dreams or rumors, each bringing a piece of their own sorrow to leave by the fountain. They did not know his name, but they felt his absence, as one feels the warmth after stepping out of the shadow of a storm, and they called the place the House of the Gentle Knight. The monks let them stay, for the world had tired of divisions. I found myself among them, neither priestess nor queen, only witness. I tended the herbs that grew too fast now, their roots drinking something older than rain, and when the pilgrims asked for a blessing, I gave them water from the basin, and it shimmered faintly between my fingers like melted glass. Sometimes, when dusk folded itself into the mountains and the light turned red enough to remember blood, I could hear a low hum in the air, the same melody that had once torn open heaven. And though no one else seemed to notice, the birds would pause on the roof tiles, listening as if the sound reminded them of their purpose. In those moments, I would close my eyes and answer it under my breath, a harmony so small that only the stones could hear it. The world beyond the hills changed as well. though slowly. The old courts fractured, their soldiers dissolving into wind. The cities that had worshipped fear began to crumble without their masters. And in their ruins, people found the strange courage to speak kindly to one another again. The storm had become the wind itself, whispering repentance through the trees. I did not correct them. Truth is not a monument, but a seed. It must be scattered to grow. What mattered was that they remembered the lesson buried inside the horror, that mercy is stronger than law, and that every heart, even the immortal, is merely waiting for someone to call it home. I kept the sword where he had left it, untouched, though sometimes the monks lit candles around it on stormy nights. The blade had begun to rust near the hilt, yet where the rust met the sunlight, it glittered like veins of gold, as if corruption itself had been convinced to participate in beauty. My grandmother lived long enough to see the valley bloom again. She said the soil had forgiven the sky, which was her way of saying that she believed peace might last. When she died one quiet morning under the cypress, her last request was that I sing her the old melody once more. So I did, and as her breath thinned, the fountain rose to meet it, the water trembling in perfect rhythm. She smiled before she went, whispering that forgiveness had found us after all. The monks buried her by the gate, where the first light touches the stones, and every dawn the mist curls around her grave like a shawl. Years turned the miracle into custom. The house of the gentle night became a refuge for those who had no names left to live under, and I grew older among them, a keeper of what couldn't be explained. I did not age the way others did. The mark beneath my skin kept a slow, deliberate time, as if measuring its strength against eternity. On the mornings when the air smelled of rain, I would climb to the bell tower and look east. The wind there was different, softer, but restless. And once, when the sun struck the valley just right, I saw it shimmer into a figure for the briefest instant, tall and dark against the horizon, the gold in its eyes catching the light. It was gone before I could call out, leaving only the sound of wings. Perhaps it was him, or perhaps it was only the world reminding me that redemption is never an ending, but a conversation still going on between the living and the forgiven. Now the monastery sleeps under its mantle of ivy and prayer, the fountain still singing, the sword still shining where he left it. At night, when the wind rises and the candles gutter, the song returns, threading through the halls with the tenderness of memory. It no longer sounds like mourning. It sounds like a vow kept. Sometimes in the quiet after midnight, I whisper the answer he once asked of me on that road, the question that started everything. Yes, I still believe in forgiveness. And every time I say it, the air stirs, the water brightens, and for one heartbeat, the entire world breathes with me, as if remembering that even the darkest stories can end in light.